everyone, and welcome to this session of AAC in the Cloud. We're really glad to have you here. We have with us today Lori Geist, and she will be doing our next presentation. The title of the presentation is Embedding Core Vocabulary in Emergency Literacy Routine. I can't read. Emergent literacy. I'm going to let her tell you. She's going to do a great session about core vocabulary. So here you go, Lori. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to Brian and your team at Cough Drop for organizing AAC in the Cloud. I'm very happy for the opportunity to talk about ideas for teaching AAC and specifically the use of core vocabulary in the context of common emergent literacy routines. I am on faculty at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies. And the teaching strategies I'll share today are part of the collective research and development that our team at the Literacy Center, as well as many others around the world, have been doing. I love the Beyond the Now theme of the conference and the variety of meaningful ways it can be interpreted. It made me think of how, as a field, we're continuing to learn and grow together to move beyond what we know now. One of my very favorite quotes from Maya Angelou is, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And it's likely in sessions today, I had the opportunity to participate in a few that you've heard presenters say things like, we used to think that, fill in the blank. And now we know that, fill in the new insight that we have across a broad range of areas of focus in AAC. And so what I'll share today reflects insights from the research and work we've been doing in classrooms as a part of our research at the Literacy Center for a number of years, and specifically pulling largely from a multi-year effort called Project Core. Again, it reflects the best of what we know now, and we're always working to move beyond the now and continue to learn. We were incredibly fortunate to receive funding through the US Department of Education for this work. And one of the things that's related to that funding is that everything that I'll share in terms of the available resources are free. They're open access, invite you to use them, make adjustments as you need to suit your specific needs. Again, we're fortunate to be able to do this work. It's important for us to start with a shared understanding of the group of students that I'll be focusing on in the points that I'll share today. The students we'll be focused on are those who are not yet using speech, sign language, or symbols on an AAC system to communicate in flexible ways. This group of students have historically had limited access to AAC systems, in part because of policies and service delivery models that call for students with the most significant disabilities to demonstrate their ability to use a system before one is provided, which most would agree is the wrong way around, but it is a barrier many face. And I'll be featuring resources again from this open source implementation model called Project Core that's designed to build on all forms of communication, including those forms that are at the earliest stages. So communication forms like body movements and facial expressions and vocalizations. With Project Core, we're focusing specifically on supporting teachers and classroom professionals in tuning into these early forms of communication and then making meaningful connections and making links to symbolic forms of communication using AAC. I'm a speech language pathologist by clinical training, part of a team of speech pathologists and special educators. Karen Erickson, Claire Greer are special educators on our team. Penny Hatch, Nancy Quick are my colleagues in speech language. And we spend a lot of time discussing how do we work collaboratively and specifically with respect to our application in the classroom, and looking at teachers and classroom professionals as a way to build capacity and really increase the meaningful teaching and learning opportunities that our students have with respect to AAC. There are 5 teaching practices that are central to the Project Core implementation model. And we'll start by talking about these 5 teaching practices just briefly. And then the focus of today is going to be how these teaching practices can be applied during common literacy routines like shared reading, which was discussed on a number of sessions today. Jane Farrell kicked things off in the keynote with a focus on shared reading. So we'll talk about implementing these teaching practices within emergent literacy routines like shared reading, as well as 4 others. There are a number of resources on the Project Core site. What's referenced here is an annotated bibliography, which provides access to additional reading and research references specific to these teaching practices. Identifying, attributing meaning, and honoring students' early communication acts is vital to student communication development. By identifying the ways students express themselves and telling students very clearly what they have done to communicate with us. By doing this, we're helping students to understand how their communication influences others. Helping our students make these connections is so important, particularly for our students with severe disabilities, many of whom have complicated bodies, and their early forms of expression likely look quite a bit different than that of their typical peers. And it's really up to communication partners to work to identify and honor these forms of communication by interpreting the meaning, very clearly telling the student what they did to communicate with us, honoring that form of expression, and then taking advantage of the opportunity to show them a symbolic form using an AAC system. And we'll talk specifically about the teaching practice of aided language input. We know from the development research literature that attributing meaning to early communication acts absolutely influences later language and communication outcomes. So saying things like, I see you pointing, you want that. I see you smiling, you like that. I see you turning away, you want to stop. As we think and talk in a few minutes about the teaching practices of attributing meaning to these early behaviors, they can be effectively paired with the teaching practice of providing aided language. So by pointing to the symbol that could be used to communicate the same message or to expand on a message that's been communicating using one of these earlier forms. Also central to the Project Core implementation model is that all students need to have access to their own personal AAC system. And we're specifically leveraging core vocabulary on those AAC systems. The AAC systems that students have personal access to need to provide useful vocabulary. And again, for us, that focus has been on the use of core vocabulary. Core vocabulary refers to the words that account for most of our face-to-face communication. And there's a lot of important published resources on core vocabulary. We have a number of modules that are available that go into more detail on core vocabulary within the Project Core resources. With Project Core, we're specifically leveraging a universal core vocabulary, which we've defined as a list of 36 words. These words were prioritized based on their usefulness in the classroom, as well as across a variety of social interactions. All of the words are useful during daily activities, social interactions, as well as during academic instruction. Over the past few years on Project Core, we've had the opportunity to get to know more than 200 students who are learning to use the universal core vocabulary with access to those prioritized words on speech-generating devices, on AAC communication apps in the form of print-based communication boards or books, as well as through 3D symbols for some of our students who are blind and benefit from that tactile representation. As I mentioned at the intro, many students with significant cognitive disabilities who are at early levels of communication ability do not currently have access to their own AAC systems with core vocabulary. And it became very clear early in our work with Project Core, and we kicked off this work in 2015, that the majority of students in our first year partner school did not have any form of AAC available to them. and that making it a requirement that all students have access to a commercial system was going to be an immediate barrier to moving forward with the work we had intended with respect to building an implementation model. So to address this barrier, we created several formats that are available for free download that are intended to serve as a starting point so that instruction can begin right away. So the idea of these available print-based communication systems that represent the unit that provide access to the universal core are intended to get all students on the path to using AAC. In many cases, our students are using an AAC system when we look more broadly at the schools that are taking advantage of the Project Core implementation model, and the universal core vocabulary are available on a broad range of AAC speech generating devices, on AAC apps, on other published print resources. So when students have an existing AAC system, we have a simple key that's available that can be downloaded from the project website that teams can use to record where the universal core words are found on those systems. And the goal is to support teachers and classroom professionals in efficiently locating those core words to support their use of aided language input and related strategies throughout the day. As I mentioned, we also have 3D symbols that represent all 36 words, and each tactual symbol includes a unique raised element, the printed word, and Braille. We have a number of supporting documents that provide a bit more detail, but the program recommends starting with go, like, and not with respect to the 3D symbols. These 3 words are flexible enough to use across environments and contexts to meet a variety of needs. And as I mentioned, there's additional resources that provide more detailed guidance as you're getting started, and would welcome having additional conversation with anyone who's interested about the 3D symbols and where we are in terms of research and recommendations there. Providing aided language input using students' AAC systems is a central teaching practice in the Project Core model. As I mentioned, this topic has been covered by several presenters during the conference. There's a strong and growing evidence base for the importance of providing aided language input. In its simplest form, it involves a communication partner pointing to graphic symbols on an AAC system while speaking, and showing students what is possible and how they can use the symbols that are available to them all day long. As part of the interactions that involve aided language input, we want to invite students, we want to invite them to initiate, we want to invite them to respond while we're providing sufficient time for them to do so, recognizing, tuning in, acknowledging explicitly all of their attempts to communicate with us on their AAC system or through other forms. As we provide aided language input, it's important to try to take the student's perspective and consider what they could say and what they'd likely want to say. Part of the process is for us to get comfortable using the systems as we're talking. We found with Project Core that as we were having the opportunity to work in collaboration with a number of teachers and professionals in classrooms, that we felt the need to include content in our professional development modules that would discourage an emphasis on using aided language input to correct or direct behaviors. So we rarely discourage using aided language input. So it's not discouraging using the teaching strategy. It's encouraging using the teaching strategy in a different way. So what we were observing was the use of aided language input when students were, they threw something across the room, and the response would be, I told you to stop doing that, while providing aided language input for stop, or pointing to not and like as teachers were being, or as students rather, were being corrected. I do not like it when you throw the book. And rather, we want to take the student's perspective. So rather than encouraging, rather than redirecting, we want to model how they could say finished or stop or want different in this situation. And this might seem like a subtle distinction, but in terms of demonstrating the power of the words students have available to them for expressive communication, it's an important distinction. When you get started with aided language input, what we found is most effective is to start with one, maybe two symbols, again, for our students who are just getting started. They're just getting on the path to using symbolic communication. So point to one or two symbols that match what you're saying. Generally speaking, we suggest teachers use symbols one level higher of one level of convention higher. So for students who are just getting started using single symbols, demonstrate the use of single symbols. For students who are already demonstrating use of single symbols, show them how to put two symbols together. Once students begin to use single symbols, continue to provide aided language input and start pointing to and repeating and the symbols the student used and expanding on that use. So after representing the symbol the student used, demonstrate a slightly more complete message by adding one more symbol. This is the way to work very specifically on language development. For example, this particular situation, this student and teacher were playing an alphabet game together, and the student pointed to the symbol go and looked outside at the bright sunshiny day that he really wanted to go enjoy. And the teacher responded by repeating and pointing to the word go, and then adding want and saying, you want to go, as she pointed to want and then go, clearly acknowledging his communication that he wanted to go outside. And they negotiated a bit, and the teacher told him they can go when finished. And she pointed to the words can, go, and finished, providing aided language input. When the student then pointed to finished, because he was pretty committed to like, okay, let's call this a wrap, she repeated it by pointing to the word finished, honoring his expression, and then added not, as she told him they're not finished, and pointed to not and finished. So again, she was keeping him focused on the lesson. That's a little bit different than the redirecting that I was mentioning earlier. They were having this collaborative exchange and negotiation around the lesson. In Project Core, we're focused on encouraging communication without requiring it. Given this idea of not requiring it, we think it's super important to avoid interactions becoming more about symbol identification and doing specifically what an adult has told them or encouraged them to say, versus being about them leading the interaction and their personal expression. We really want to provide lots of opportunities for students to see how symbols are used and motivate them to attempt to use symbols and then build on those attempts. Of course, wait time for students learning to use AAC is so very important. And it's not easy for teachers who are working with diverse groups of students, particularly during group lessons, to provide the amount of time many of our students need to respond. But the goal is to help teachers identify ways to keep this idea of wait time front of mind and really slow down and wait as much as possible to invite and support that communication. And then finally, the idea of embedding communication instruction across the school day follows the recommendations of decades of research on the benefits of naturalistic teaching. And this idea that teaching communication can happen during common academic routines and daily activities, can happen alongside specials like art and music and phys ed, therapy time and related services with speech therapists and physical therapists and OTs. There are literally countless of opportunities throughout the day to show students how to use AAC and specifically show them how to use core vocabulary. When we consider any typical school day, there really are abundant opportunities to teach from the time kids arrive to the time they head home. And these opportunities to teach communication They present during academic lessons while teachers and other classroom professionals are working with kids. They also present during common activities like morning meeting and lunch and free play. And we're trying to build on all of those opportunities. Today, we're going to focus specifically on applying these key communication teaching practices in the context of emergent literacy routines. And as I review each of these common literacy routines, our focus will be on how teachers and classroom professionals can maximize communication throughout the lesson. Again, encouraging you to consider these routines as examples with the principles and practices for teaching communication in AAC applicable to many other areas of academic instruction, as well as other types of activities that you may be working on and supporting within your classroom. So I forgot to mention at the beginning, I am going to try to keep my eye on the Slack channel. So if you have questions throughout the session, if you want to put them in the Slack channel, I'll try to pop out there periodically without it slowing us down as a group too much. Melissa, if you see anything pop in there, invitation to interrupt me if there are things that it would be best for me to answer as we go. And if not, I will certainly be responsive to those after. So I am going to just see if I can pop out quickly and take a look. All right, question about motor planning. I will love to talk a little bit more about that. The idea of interaction, how do you make, I'd like the comment about avoiding interactions becoming more about what we want them to do and make sure it's still about the interaction made by the student communicating. I feel this can be lost. Yes, agree. And does Project Core account for motor learning principles when expanding to larger 32 location board or to an SGD? In terms of motor planning, one of the things that we've tried to do with the, I apologize, I'm having a little bit of a technical glitch here with my email. One of the things we tried to do with the formats that are available for download is have consistency in location across those formats. And some of that is with the idea of as students move from perhaps a 4 location across multiple pages to all 36 on one board, that the relative position of the symbols stays consistent. That is a little bit different than some of the work that's been done on motor planning, which is not a central part of Project Core. And again, would be happy to have longer conversation about that. We really have, with the downloadable versions that are there, we've worked with a number of schools that are using various systems that are designed with motor planning in mind, and the universal core vocabulary is represented on those systems, and that works quite well for many of the students we've supported. On the downloadable formats, it wasn't one of the primary design requirements, in part because we were focused on creating systems that would support teachers and a broad range of professionals being able to pick up a system and be able to use it from one system to the next. And so again, probably a longer conversation that could be had with respect to motor planning. So moving on to our first routine, shared reading. And those of you that had an opportunity to participate in Jane Farrell's keynote this morning got to spend a lot of time digging into shared reading. And we'll just talk briefly about it this afternoon. Shared reading is a type of reading that focuses on the interaction that happens between an adult and a student or a group of students while reading together. The goal of shared reading is to maximize interaction, helping students make connections between the book and the things they already know or are interested in. We're emphasizing the use of comments and open-ended questions versus questions with a right or a wrong answer. We ultimately want our students to lead the direction of the interaction. And we, as the more knowledgeable adult interacting around the book with our students, we want to relinquish control as students do lead. Effective teaching and interaction and shared reading requires that we provide students with sufficient time by pausing and waiting. Again, that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, with shared reading, is to find that appropriate pace that everyone's engaged. It's not at a pace that's so slow that students are checking out, particularly when you're trying to support a group of students. But at the same time, you need to set the pace that all students have opportunity to fully participate and to maximize those interactions. Shared reading has been called the single most important activity for developing the knowledge required for eventual success in reading. Shared reading is recognized in the research literature as a key context for language and literacy intervention for children with and without disabilities. The research on shared reading in students with disabilities consistently suggests that it supports the development of the same emergent literacy and language skills that are developed in children with and without the same literacy and language skills that are developed in children without disabilities. Throughout shared reading, students must have access to their own communication systems. Students may interact in other ways, and we certainly encourage them to interact in other ways, but they should always have access to their own system. And again, within Project Core, an emphasis on access to the universal core vocabulary. Adults can use the student's personal communication system as they're providing aided language input and demonstrating comments. They could also use a system that is similar to the student's communication system, particularly during group instruction. Teachers will often have a version of the universal core vocabulary that they're using for interactions throughout the lesson. As I mentioned, what you want to keep in mind with shared reading is that the goal is all about maximizing student interaction with adults as well as with other students. During shared reading, we're helping students make connections between the book and the things that they already know or that they already have some experience. Adults help students make these connections through comments, not questions. In fact, we avoid questions as much as possible. We will use some open-ended questions, but it's really about making a comment, inviting participation. Adults do the reading, and usually adults lead the interaction, particularly when shared reading is new. But again, as students begin to take the lead, we want to show them how to make comments about the book, taking long pauses and inviting their participation. When we see students communicating in any way, we respond, either acknowledging and honoring what they've done, repeating, adding a little more, building on that interaction, taking it in the direction that our students want to go. So again, when we see students interacting, participating in any way, we focus on the use of the words that the students have access to on their system to show them how they could use their communication system to interact. We keep comments simple, highlight 1 or 2 words on the student system, and the book supports using simple comments by providing meaningful context. So again, often we can say go, we can say look, because we're referencing something specific in the book. An easy way to remember how to maximize interactions during shared reading is this acronym, follow the CAR, where C stands for comment, A stands for ask for participation, and R stands for respond. If you had the opportunity to listen to Jane's opening session, Jane shared she's shifted from using the acronym CAR to putting the CAR in the air, using the acronym AIR for remembering essentially the same 3 ingredients. So whether CAR or AIR helps you remember, the fundamental teaching recommendations that we're talking about here are consistent. After reading the text on the page, as the adult supporting the shared reading, you make a simple comment. You invite that participation. You're waiting 10 or more seconds to give students time to communicate in some way, asking for their participation by making requests like "tell me," gesturing towards their communication system, or perhaps by repeating your original comment, inviting their participation. And then again, waiting with interest. We're responding when students communicate in some way, repeat what they did or said, add a little more, and then offer them enough wait time to communicate again and continue the interaction. We found that reading's more successful when we plan our comments beforehand. So it's also something we can do to help other professionals like teaching assistants and paraprofessionals step in to teach communication during their one-on-one opportunities and shared reading with their students. Planning comments beforehand really just sets everyone up for success. It helps teachers maximize their use of core vocabulary, which in turn maximizes opportunities for students to engage and have opportunities to learn to use the core vocabulary that's available to them. We plan them ahead of time, but we're not then rigidly tied to those comments. Again, we're relinquishing control as students begin to take the lead during our shared interactions. I want to just talk through one example scenario of a teacher and a small group of students. This portion of the lesson that was observed, again, was part of Project Core, and the teacher was reading from the Tar Heel Reader, a book from the Tar Heel Reader library called Noses with a small group. This book was written by one of our favorite authors on Tar Heel Reader, Jane Farrell. The teacher started by reading the title Noses, and then used a student's personal communication system to make the one-word comment, "look." She then paused and waited, and she watched her students closely, looking for any form of communication. And when she saw nothing, she showed the students the picture and demonstrated and said, "look again," and added, "look, a nose," and waited. After a few seconds, one of the students put her hand on her AAC system, and the teacher saw her movement and said, "I see your hand, tell me." Again, pausing, waiting. A few seconds later, the student looked at the teacher and then the book. And the teacher said, "You're looking at the book. I think you want me to read more." And then she pointed to more on the student's AAC system and said, "I'll read more." On the next page, the teacher read the text, "dog nose," and then said, "different nose," pointing to the symbols for different on the student's core board, pointing to the symbol for different on the student's core board. The teacher, of course, then paused and waited for the students to communicate. And about 10 seconds later, she flipped to the previous page and pointed to the picture of the tiger's nose, and then back to the current page and pointed to the dog nose. She then repeated her comment, "different nose," while waiting and pointing to the symbol for different. About that time, one student used speech. She yelled out, "I have a dog." And the teacher responded by saying, "you do," pointing to the symbols you and do, and then allowed the interaction to move in the direction of students talking about their pets. Most of the time, it's best to keep your comment short. Again, we're encouraging the use of core words with students, supporting how they could use the core words that are available to them to make similar comments or to take things in the direction that's of greatest interest to them. After you've planned your core comments, one of the simple strategies that we found helpful is to add sticky notes to each page of the book. And as you turn the page, remove the sticky note that you've put in there just as a reminder. It really only takes a few minutes to add these reminders. And again, in our experience, it really sets everyone up for success.
Lori, I'm going to jump in for 1 second. You had a question in the Slack chat.
Yes.
That they want to know, do you have a list of planned comments like somewhere in the room? And you kind of addressed this a little bit, or is it per lesson format that you specify that, or excuse me, you make specific planned comments for? So I'll let you address that.
So a couple things. Let me just a list of planned comments posted in the room. So what we found is sometimes teachers will actually have multiple sticky notes in a book that they use repeatedly, and then they decide which comments they're going to use for any particular reading. As most of us know, and we all have favorite books, and our students have favorite books, and we can read books over and over again, as long as, again, particularly around the goals of shared reading and this idea of maximizing interaction. So your comments can be different from one reading to the next. So teachers will often have lists that they've planned ahead of time for each reading of the book. We have some planning, a planning document that allows you to plan, I think it's 4 readings of the same book with 4 different sets of comments that's available through the Project Core site. And it's also a really lovely segue into the additional resources I was going to mention, which is the sharedreader.org website, which also provides access to the shared tar reader.org book interface. And this project is an extension of the work that we've been doing with Project Core, focused specifically on shared reading. And within the shared reading implementation model supports that are available through this website and the shared reader book interface, you can plan the comments that are then directly tied to the Tar Heel Reader library of books. So there's a variety of different ways that you can build those lists of comments to continue to come back to. Does that answer the question? Guess it's a tricky one to follow up. Well, Melissa and I are the only one in the room, but I'll pop back out to Slack to see if there's any follow-up on that.
I think that was good. Thank you, Lori.
Awesome. Fantastic. The next routine that I want to spend a little bit of time on is called predictable chart writing. And this is, we've talked about shared reading. This is a structured shared writing routine that helps students learn a variety of early literacy skills. Predictable chart writing is a multi-step group activity that supports a focus on communication using core vocabulary. Instructions aimed at building important understandings of concepts about print. Focused on supporting emergent writers, can also provide important supports for beginning conventional readers and writers. It supports learning related to word identification and spelling and punctuation. Predictable chart writing revolves around a chart that teachers and students create together. It's a 5-step process. Depending on the skills of your students, each step can be completed on a separate day, or multiple steps can be combined into a single lesson. For many of the classes we've been working with, predictable chart writing is completed over a 5-day period. So it's a 5-day lesson plan, if you will, for shared writing. And so we'll go over each step in a bit more detail, as if we were completing one step each day. So on Monday, we'll work on step 1, and step 1 is the group creates the chart together. And this is an example of a completed chart, and the topic of the chart is cold outside. And the teacher selected this topic and the title of the chart based on a theme being explored in the class during the week. She then selected the sentence stem I put on, and she intentionally used words from the 36 words in the Universal Core Vocabulary. Sometimes the sentence stem only includes 1 or 2 words from the Universal Core. In this example, all 3 are core words. Selecting words from the Universal Core, it gives teachers the opportunity to repeatedly demonstrate each sentence using the Universal Core Vocabulary System. In addition to selecting the title and the words for the sentence stem, it's important to decide what choices will be provided to students to complete the sentence stem, and how those choices will be presented. So while The sentence stem is the most important part of each sentence. The choice is also important because it helps increase students' interest and engagement. In the case of this particular example with the chart title, Cold Outside, the teacher introduced real objects, and specifically she brought in a basket of things to put on when it's cold outside. And before starting the chart, she pulled out each item out of the basket, named it, and then put it on while pointing to it. So she would say and show on an AAC system, I put on, and then she'd put on mittens. I put on, and then she would put on a hat. So an opportunity to introduce the choices, model the universal core vocabulary. She repeated the sequence of I put on, again, going through each item that would be made available as a choice to students. Then the teacher started writing the chart with the students. So she wrote the sentence stem saying the words aloud while the students watched. She talked about the letters and words as she was writing. So this is an important piece and sometimes a bit of a stumbling block. We've seen teachers with the best of intentions write out the chart in its entirety before the lesson got started. And the idea of day one, step one with predictable chart writing is that it's a shared writing activity. And so as the teacher or the classroom professional, you are writing the chart with your students. It's critical that they have the opportunity to see you writing and to be a part of that process. So as the teacher wrote, I put on, she then gave a student, this particular student, Sarah, a chance to select the item she'd put on when it's cold. So again, first, the teacher demonstrated put on using Sarah's universal core display. And then Sarah selected the hat from the basket. And the teacher finished the sentence by writing hat. And then she added Sarah's name so that everyone could remember who contributed that sentence to the predictable chart. So while writing the chart, one of the things that's important is to carefully line up each of the words in the sentence. Seeing the words written clearly and stacked up in this way is what really helps students develop important understandings of the concept of word. For some, it helps them learn to identify the word in print. This final chart has 7 sentences. You can see 3 students selected hat to make the sentence I put on hat, and 2 selected coat, I put on a coat, 1 selected boots, and 1 selected gloves. In selecting the topics and the stems for the chart, be creative. There are literally thousands of chart topics that could be supported, emphasizing the use of core vocabulary in sentence stems, providing important repetition with variety that we know is so important for our students. So this just offers a few examples. I put on as the sentence stem. You could use that with the theme of the colors of leaves on trees, funny costumes, ice cream topics. Again, if we had more time, we could as a group come up with a much longer list. I like as a sentence stem, literally, countless possibilities there. I want to go, again, depending on what the appropriate theme may be for any particular lesson. So on the second day, the second step of predictable chart writing is to read and reread the chart and together and talk about it, analyze it for some carefully selected text elements. The primary goal of this step is to help students focus on specific aspects of the text. So for students who are beginning communicators, it's very valuable for students to have the opportunity to see teachers and their peers using the language that's a part of their sentence that they contributed. This helps students learn that print carries meaning, helping them develop important concepts of words and letters. And this is a step that sometimes teachers kind of rush through, and you really want to take a lot of time. So read it together first. Read first to provide a good model for students, then reread it as a group, and then talk about it and analyze specific elements of the chart. So for example, when you talk about the chart, the goal is not to read the STEM word by word using the core vocabulary, but rather to talk about the chart. For example, talking about the things that students thought about and that they wear when it's cold outside. So the teacher might emphasize the things that students selected that are the same and are different. So we may talk about Sarah's sentence that I put on a hat. Let's find sentences that are the same or different. And the teacher may point to same and different on the universal core. On Wednesday, we're moving on to reading the sentence as part of sentence strips. So the first step in this is teachers write each student's sentence on an individual sentence strip, and then give each student a copy of the sentence they created on a single sentence strip. The student's encouraged to read the sentence, even when it's clear that they can't read just yet. As the adult, you support the student by reading and pointing to each word and saying each word. After reading and rereading the sentence, students are supported in cutting the sentence into individual words. Some students will be able to use scissors independently to try to cut. Many will be physically unable to use scissors. And so as adults, we help them by running fingers across the sentence strip and asking the student to indicate using a gesture or vocalization or some other form where to stop. The whole point of cutting the sentence into individual words is to help students develop an understanding of concept of word and to help them begin to recognize the place where one word ends and another begins. So what we want to avoid is drawing lines, making dots, anything that otherwise cues students regarding where they should cut. Instead, we really want to help students learn to look for the places where one word ends and another begins. So we want to give students the time they need to figure it out, by doing. And after each student has made one attempt to cut the sentence into individual words by themselves, we want to review it with them and see if they have successfully cut into separate words. If not, we have a second sentence strip available to work together to cut it into individual words. After the sentence is cut into individual words, mix up the words, ask students to arrange the words to recreate their sentence. And after each attempt, we want to read the words in the order that the student placed them. So in this example, Kiana placed the words "on boots put I," and the teacher read it while pointing to each word and then asked Kiana, "Does that sound right?" She then referred back to the chart and read the sentence in the correct order before asking Kiana to try again. The teacher repeated this process one more time before eventually helping Kiana recreate the sentence correctly. The fourth step in predictable chart writing is to help students work together to rebuild the sentences. And during this activity, the adult writes the words from each sentence on a full-size sheet of paper. It's only necessary to write the words from the sentence stem once. Each word is printed with a large, thick marker in a font that's large enough for students to see from the front of the class. And then students are given individual words from the sentence, and the adults read them aloud and demonstrate how to say the core words from the sentence stem using the universal core vocabulary. And then the final step in predictable chart writing leads to a book that can be shared throughout the rest of the year. Some teachers make the book themselves on Thursday evening before moving into Friday's lesson. Others give students some choices of the images to add to each page, and others actually take photos of the students with the objects they selected for the chart. When possible, you want to take the time to include students in selecting the images and that are used to illustrate their contributions to the book, so that they can, again, kind of make important connections to the writing. You can use, you can choose to make the book with paper and printed images, or use tools like Tar Heel Reader or other computer or internet-based tools. What's important about step 5 is that it results in a permanent record of the student's work. Having a book provides an important artifact that students can return to over and over again. These books are often favorites in terms of shared reading. So with predictable chart writing, it's important to plan a few things ahead of time. You need to plan the chart topic and title, create the sentence stem, and have a clear plan for what the choices will, what choices you'll present to students, and how those choices will be presented and accessed by students. So I am going to pop out to the Slack channel for a second, take a quick look. Would it be okay to pre-write part of the chart in pencil with the core words you planned on using that week, then go over in marker as you create it together? We've found that it works best to actually write it together. So you may have that as part of your planning documentation, and you have those things that you've thought about in terms of you've planned out your sentence stem. So that sentence stem is going to be consistent from one sentence to the next. And so you certainly have that planned out and can be using core vocabulary, but would encourage actually not having it written before you start the lesson, but actually engage as a group in that shared writing it with the group. So I'm realizing I intentionally included quite a few additional slides within the materials that I shared on the AAC in the Cloud website. And so I think one of the things that I'm going to do is just share some of the additional resources that are available, and talk a little bit about the 3 additional emergent literacy routines and the resources that you can find at Project Core. So we talked about shared reading, we talked about predictable chart writing, independent reading, independent writing, and using core vocabulary during alphabet knowledge and phonological awareness are 3 additional emergent literacy routines that we have resources available on the Project Core website. There are professional development modules. There are 12 modules that can be accessed through the project website that go through each of these emergent literacy routines in detail and tie specifically to the planning resources and teacher supports that are available for these routines. There's a number of additional research and publication resources that are available on the website, as well as the downloadable universal core vocabulary formats. I would welcome the opportunity to answer any follow-up questions, have additional discussion. My email is available here, would certainly be available for additional follow-up conferences as participants have an interest. And I think on that, I'm going to pause for just a minute and pop back out to the Slack channel and take a look at any questions there. Yes, switch activated adaptive scissors, absolutely. Bring in all of those types of supports. I think the one thing, the point I was making there in terms of the sliding our fingers across, is anything we can do to make sure that kids are actually doing the cutting versus a classroom professional doing the cutting, in terms of students telling us where. I like the books and the kids really enjoying having them, especially since they have ownership. Absolutely. That's what we found as well, Diana. Project Core had more samples on planning core comments. Shared reading knows this book. Yes. So if you go to sharedreading.org, you'll find additional modules there, as well as the planning document, which provides access to, again, a reproducible lesson planning support for thinking through the comments that you might want to use for any number of books in your library. All right, I think I am running close to the end of time, but would welcome any additional questions before we wrap up for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Lori. We've really appreciated your input and your insight through your experience. We've had the chance to work a little bit with Project Core in Cough Drop and incorporate some of those boards there, and they are a huge help to a lot of families, and we appreciate all that you're doing. The ideas that you shared, very good for implementation and easy ways that we can pull in and be a little bit better, because that's kind of what we're aiming for, right? To get a little bit better and to take the next step and improve. So thank you very much for all of that. I'm just going to let you, if there's any last second things you want to jump in and share, I'm just going to check the Slack chat one more time, make sure we don't have any questions, because I'd hate to have somebody miss out. But I think Lori, you're in Slack too. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to post them in there, and hopefully we can get an answer for you on that. Thank you everyone for attending this session. We have another session coming up in just a couple of minutes, so feel free to jump into the next session or view one that has already been recorded, but we're glad to have had you here. And thanks for being part of AAC in the Cloud.